Se escúchate ahí.
Muy buenas tardes a todos, todas, todes. Sean ustedes bienvenidos a la conferencia central de nuestro Congreso de IASPOM de Latinoamérica. Welcome, Sylvia. Es un placer tener a Sylvia con nosotros. Quiero agradecer, por supuesto, al comité organizador pues, por darnos el privilegio de contar con esta conferencia hoy. Algunos aspectos técnicos. La conferencia Sylvia la va a dar en inglés. Hay una traducción escrita del texto sobre el cual ella va a ir. Los códigos QR están o a la entrada para español y portugués, están en la lista de correos electrónicos que Laura mandó, o en el programa web también encuentran el código QR pues para los que quieran seguir el texto en español o en portugués. Tenemos la colaboración de la intérprete quien va a estar a cargo de las preguntas. Para la sección de las preguntas, les rogamos el favor que traten una idea a la vez para que ella pueda traducirle a Sylvia y pues tengamos una respuesta más clara. ¿Qué más se nos está escapando? Así pues, sin más ni más, vamos a darle la bienvenida. Ah, y el uso de la mascarilla, por favor. Apenas termine yo me enmascaro.
Sylvia, en algún momento se sale.
Ah, sí. Otro asunto, como ustedes van a estar leyendo la traducción del texto que Sylvia nos está compartiendo, si en algún momento Sylvia necesita salirse del texto que está escrito, ella le va a hacer una señal a la intérprete y vamos a tener la traducción en vivo, la traducción simultánea de esos pequeños comentarios que no estén dentro del texto escrito, que es un formato muy chévere. Bueno. La doctora Sylvia Antonia Nannyonga Tamusuza es profesora asociada de música con una especialización en etnomusicología y es la directora del Departamento de Artes Escénicas y Cine y es miembro del Senado Universitario de la Universidad Makerere. Se gradúa de la Universidad Pittsburgh en Estados Unidos bajo la supervisión del profesor Andrew Weintraub. Y Sylvia es la coordinadora de los proyectos de etnomusicología en Uganda Projects y la fundadora de la curaduría de la Universidad de Makerere del archivo audiovisual Klaus Waxman. Ella ha publicado sobre música popular, música de la Iglesia Católica, competencias de las escuelas musicales, la danza como música, la sexualidad en la música y la danza, las políticas y el género en la música, la interfase entre la etnomusicología, la educación musical y las identidades en las músicas diaspóricas, la repatriación musical y los archivos. Sus publicaciones incluyen el libro Bakisimba, Gender in Music and Dance of the Baganda People of Uganda, publicado por Routledge en el 2005, y también muchísimos artículos en revistas y en volúmenes editados. Ella es la coeditora del libro Ethnomusicology in East Africa, Perspectives from Uganda and Beyond, del 2012. Su investigación actual es sobre la negociación de las mujeres para la paz y la resolución de conflictos utilizando las artes expresivas, la movilidad de género musical y los estudios de archivo basados en el centro de multimedia de la universidad, en las colecciones, la decolonización de, abro comillas, la educación musical de África en Uganda y la migración de la música de África y de vuelta hacia África. Sylvia es miembro de la Sociedad de Etnomusicología y fue parte del Comité de Dirección Estratégica entre el 2017 y 2021. Sin más, entonces, le damos la bienvenida a Sylvia.
Gracias. Thank you so much. I want to first of all
Muchas gracias. Primero quisiera
I want to thank all of you for coming.
agradecer a todo el mundo por estar acá.
But most important, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me.
Y de forma más importante agradecer a los organizadores por invitarme.
Most especially Professor Laura. She's now my sister. I can afford to call her just Laura. Thank you so much for the journey we've walked together since 2021.
Agradece especialmente a la profesora Laura Jordán. Se muestra agradecida por el viaje que han recorrido juntas desde el año 2021.
And all the hassle for the visas. Thank you so much
Y
for
por el
working with me.
apoyo en la obtención de la visa. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, Uganda is 7 hours ahead of here.
Uganda está con una diferencia horaria de 7 horas, más que nosotros.
So I was calling her even at night.
Entonces me tocó llamar por teléfono en la noche.
This is my first time to come to the continent of Latin America.
Es la primera vez que estoy en Latinoamérica.
And it's really a privilege for me
Y ha sido un privilegio para mí.
connect.
Ha sido un privilegio para mí. Sorry, I didn't hear the last thing.
I'm
you said.
saying it's really a privilege for me to connect here.
Para ella es un privilegio conectarse con este territorio, con Latinoamérica.
Okay, I'll now go to my paper. I'll try as much as possible to follow what was written, but I want to tell it was written more than three weeks ago. So probably my ideas have shifted with the fact that I've been interacting with all of you. So I'm glad that she's going to be interpreting where I add in extra words.
Bueno, Sylvia escribió este texto hace más de 3 semanas. Probablemente algunas de las ideas que ella exponga pueden haber cambiado un poco, entonces se alegra de que tenga interpretación para poder suplir esos espacios que hay en el texto.
Okay, as I mentioned, I've just been saying, Latin America as a continent is quite a distance from Uganda. And indeed, as I have said, it took me more than 1 day by plane to travel from Uganda to Chile. I would like now to share, if you
Me
could
gustaría
share
compartir
the screen, rather the next
pantalla,
slide,
la
to just
siguiente.
show Uganda in relation to Chile.
Mostrar Uganda en relación a Chile.
Probably we need to take off the lights here, I don't know,
Si se pueden bajar las luces, por favor.
unless people are seeing clearly. But if you can see,
Si
this
se
is
fijan acá,
where Uganda is. It's
ahí
a
está
very
Uganda.
it's a very tiny country.
Es un país muy
Thank
pequeño.
you. Yeah, compared to the
Comparado
other countries.
con los
But
otros
if you
países.
look, that's the map of the world.
Pero
And
si
if you
miran el mapa
can
del
link,
mundo,
you can link the map of Africa, and then you can see Brazil, Argentina, and then Chile. It's quite a distance.
si vinculan la distancia de los países que están en América, como Brasil, Argentina, se pueden dar cuenta de que hay una distancia muy larga.
However, since the 1930s, the presence of Latin America is still strong in Uganda. There is no doubt that the introduction of media technology, the gramophone in 1920s, the radio in 1953, social media since the 2000s, and back and forth intercontinental and intra-Africa travels inform this historical presence of Latin America in Uganda. Beyond media technology, since the 1950s, Latin America came to Uganda through the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, which was formerly Zaire. Specific to this presentation, music as well as its accompanying dance has enhanced to bridge this geographical divide, and while many Ugandans, including myself, have never been to Latin America till today, we have a great sense of connection through its various captivating musics and dances. However, mapping out this musical journey is very complex and would require a lifetime to unwrap. As such, my presentation, which is based on my ongoing research, will only be a scratch of the iceberg. Nevertheless, I attempt a tentative trace of the geographical travel of Ugandan Lumba, which has its roots in continental Africa, migrated to Latin America, mostly through the slave trade, and through the DRC Congo, came back to Uganda. While there are a number of African Latino-derived musics and dances that have returned to Africa, this discussion will focus on what is called Lumba in the context of Uganda. I'm saying in the context of Uganda because, as I'll discuss later on, Lumba means different things in different contexts.
Digo Uganda específicamente porque rumba significa cosas distintas en distintos contextos.
The Uganda-DRC dialogic musical exchange between 1950s and 1990s, whose remnants still survive under a generical music category of the oldies, music popularized by the FM radios and social media, will inform this discussion. This mapping, however, is very elusive, as it is with no absolute clarity of where in Africa, African music originated, or even originates, and where in Latin America, the Congolese rumba originates, since it shares much in common with other Latino genres in the different countries. It is because of this elusiveness that I make a generalized reference to Africa and Latin America. I know I've been one of those scholars that have problematized the issue of Africanizing Africa.
Soy una de las académicas que es conocida por problematizar el tema de africanizar África.
And now I'm making the same scene of Latinizing Latin America.
De latinoamericanizar Latinoamérica.
But this elusiveness is a result of the fact that there is no clear or absolute knowledge where the African came from and where Latin American is in terms of going back to Africa. And I apologize for that.
La naturaleza elusiva de trazar los orígenes. If you could repeat, please. So the elusiveness, you talked about the elusiveness of tracing the origins of...
The origins of what is African.
De lo que es África, de trazar los... La naturaleza elusiva se debe a que es difícil trazar los orígenes de lo que entendemos por África.
And as well, what is Latin American.
Y lo mismo ocurre con el concepto de Latinoamérica.
Because as we shall see, and also as my colleagues have discussed before,
así como veremos y como han dicho mis colegas antes,
thanks to Professor Noel, yesterday he talked about the fact
gracias a Profesor Noel, él ayer habló sobre
that music came from different parts of Africa,
que la música venía de diferentes partes de África,
so it is very difficult to make that disentanglement.
Y es muy difícil hacer ese desanudamiento.
Beyond the geographical ambiguity in the complexity of defining Lumba, indeed, while the term Lumba is used in Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world, it means different things, contingent on context, space, time, and persons defining it. And here I would like to quote White, 2022. Please go to the next slide. White says that even, and I quote, even in the Cuban context, Lumba means many things to many people. It seems to yearn for further research on how the various musical styles coming out of Cuba have been localized, indigenized, and reinvented elsewhere in the world. My current research is an initial step to addressing this research need. Certainly such a massive undertaking would require a collaborative effort from the two continents, and I hope that my visit today, this time, will create such interest in desiring to collaborate with me. I'll return to this definition later. As you realize, since it's a borrowing, from here.
Como se dan cuenta, como es un préstamo desde aquí
and there,
y allá,
we really need to work together.
Necesitamos actuar juntos.
And I'm hoping that we'll have partners before I go back to Uganda.
Y espera poder hacerlo antes de que ella regrese a Uganda.
People who will be interested in working on this project.
La gente que esté interesada en trabajar en este proyecto.
For this presentation, I'll examine Uganda's Lumba in terms of the dialogic link between Uganda and the DRC, which has shaped the nature of Uganda's music. There are certainly many issues that such a cultural exchange could present, indeed, but not limited to issues of syncretism, globalization, and its cousin, hybridity and intersectionality. However, a closer look at this musical exchange reveals a captivating issue of reappropriation and domestication of Latin American music, not only in the DRC Lumba, but also in the Ugandan Lumba. As a point of departure, I'll briefly examine the migration of music from Africa to Latin America to provide a foundation for a focused discussion of the musical travel of Lumba from Africa to Latin America and then to Uganda through the DRC Congo. Although modern travel possibilities, virtual and physical, have enabled more intercontinental connections between Africa and Latin America, the earliest links, as we all will agree, since the 15th century were fostered by the transatlantic slave trade. Because of this geographical proxy, there has been a tendency to limit the Latin American link to Africa, mostly to West Africa. And yet, the slave trade in its various forms has included East Africa as well. For example, Hugh Thomas has reported, and I want to quote, let's have the next slide. He has said that 5 years after Columbia's first voyage, the often underestimated East African sources of slaves were also found. He also elaborates further that some slaves were also carried to the Americas in these years from East Africa, where the fertile romantic King Sebastian of Portugal was dreaming of founding an African empire comparable to the Spanish dominions of New Spain and Peru. Further, Cuba was also one of the destinations of slaves from East Africa. Thomas reports and says in the next slide, East Africa was much bigger than those which frequented the West Coast because small boats would not so easily pass by the Cape of Good Hope. Of course, the documented evidence suggests that in Latin America, music is extraordinarily having developed over centuries as a product of cultural exchange. And I've been hearing this over and over in a number of presentations.
Y he escuchado esto en varias presentaciones frecuentemente.
Okay. Further, documented evidence suggests that in Latin America, music is extraordinarily having developed over centuries as a product of cultural exchange, especially from three broad cultures: the indigenous culture, the Spanish European culture, and the African culture. Asman, you can click, Asman has elaborated, Africans enslaved and free brought new rhythms, dances, songs, and musical practices with them to the Americas as well, creating unique syncretic blends of song, dance, and performance. And of course, specific to the current situation, Peter Fetcher has also noted that one of the most important sources of African musical influence in Latin America is the island of Cuba, which gave birth to the habanera, son, lumba, mambo, cha-cha-cha, and salsa. However, yesterday when I was listening to the presentation,
sin embargo, ayer cuando estaba escuchando una de las presentaciones,
Afro-diasporic music, again I'm quoting
música afrodiaspórica,
Noel,
está citando a Noel.
we had an interaction. It was engaging to know that there are also roots that can be pointed to. Colombia.
Tuvimos una interacción en donde dimos cuenta que puede haber raíces en Colombia.
In fact, he's just shared with me a poem. Where is it?
Incluso él compartió conmigo un poema. ¿Dónde está Noel?
Which will be very interesting to see because
Sería muy interesante ver porque tiene
it has Uganda as
tiene
a
Uganda
rose.
como una rosa, a rose,
Yeah.
como una rosa.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to know when was it written, who wrote it. And,
Le gustaría saber cuándo se escribió, quién lo escribió.
Because then that expands our understanding
Porque eso expande nuestra comprensión
of the link beyond the usually
del
known,
vínculo que usualmente se conoce
the known myth of the West African region.
de la región oeste de África.
However, the musical Africanisms evident in Latin American music are more generic than specific characteristics. Because today, of course, when we talk about repetitions, we talk about ostinato, we talk about call and response.
Porque hoy día cuando hablamos de las repeticiones, de los ostinatos,
These are also
también son
musical parameters that we find in other musics as well.
son parámetros musicales que también encontramos en otras músicas.
However, nonetheless, emphasis on rhythms that inspire dancing is the most often agreed on retention of music from Africa. Peter Manuel also agrees that while music in Africa is rich in melody, timbre variety, and even 2- or 3-part harmony, but the rhythm is often the most important aesthetic parameter. Accordingly, the rhythms of African and Afro-Caribbean traditional music are often formidably complex in ways that lack any counterparts in Western folk or common practice classical music. The other feature is the call and response, evident in various Afro-Cuban music, and yet while most music is built on repetition, Africa brought to Latin America what Manuel has called cellular structure, meaning that the pieces tend to be constructed by repetition and variation of short musical cell, or what is usually called ostinato. I will illustrate these characteristics later. Now, turning to the definition of lumba, what is lumba and how did Africa influence it? As already mentioned, the term lumba does not have one single definition. Indeed, Peter Manuel, 1995, page 22, also noted that the word rumba has long been used rather loosely in commercial dance music and salsa. He explained that, properly speaking, however, lumba denotes a traditional genre in which 2 or 3 dancers are accompanied by an ensemble consisting of 3 congas, 2 pairs of tapped sticks, and a lead singer and chorus. Manuel argues further that lumba appears to be derived from secular dances cultivated by Congolese slaves in Cuba. Again, there are gaps there that we need to unwrap, okay? There's still more research where someone from the continent partners with those from here, and we unravel what is being said.
So you said, sorry, but as I was talking, you were talking at the same time, so I wasn't able to listen, but you were saying that there's still a history to unravel, right?
Yes, exactly.
Que todavía queda una historia por descubrir, como ven.
Okay. However, in English-speaking countries, it has historically been confused with Cuban son or san, and anglicized by adding an H to spell it as R-H-U-M-B-A, rumba, as opposed to R-U-M-B-A. Indeed, Salter argues that what came to be called Congolese rumba is an inspiration from the Cuban son rather than lumba, the Cuban lumba. However, the distinction between son and lumba, at least of the 30s and 40s, is an uphill task, as son has always been a hybrid form, sharing some similar characteristics with lumba, given the shared African origin. However, the stronger use of melodic instrumentation somehow differentiates lumba from Cuban son, even if both musics have dance-inspiring rhythms. Moreover, it is clear that son is a result of creolization of European and African-derived musical elements, where European-based plucked stringed instruments, such as the guitar and the tres, a Cuban invention consisting of 3 sets of double strings, play alongside African-based percussion, such as the bongo, also a Cuban-invented instrument, the malimbura, a bass instrument derived from the African lamellophone or dambira. This instrumentation, as well as will be seen later, is closer to what the Congolese lumba and indeed the derived Ugandan lumba than that of the Cuban lumba. I would now like to look at how
Ahora voy a pasar a ver
Latin American lumba or music
la rumba latinoamericana o la música
migrated back to Africa through the
Cómo
DRC.
llegó a África a través de la RDC.
The DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the second largest country in Africa, is geographically located in the central region. I would like to play. Can you go? Yes. Oh, you've moved very fast. Go
Forward.
Yeah,
Back,
behind.
I guess.
I wanted to look at the
Back.
map.
A ver, espera. Más atrás, ¿no?
The map.
You want to go back, right?
Yes. Okay, let's move forward. I don't know what happens there.
So you wanted to play something?
Yes,
And
I
it's
wanted
not
to
there?
rotate, but it seems because of the too much light,
Parece
you are
que hay
not
mucha
able
luz, no se
to
puede
see
ver.
that. But when we look here,
Cuando miramos acá,
the DRC Congo is there,
la República Democrática del
this-
Congo está ahí
and that's where we are.
y allá es donde estamos nosotros, hacia la izquierda.
Okay, we can go to the next slide, which locates it within Africa.
Ahí
okay?
está dentro de África.
So you can see that
Pueden ver que
it's bordered with Uganda
limita con
in
Uganda.
the east, and then we have Rwanda,
Tenemos
Burundi,
Ruanda, Burundi,
Tanzania,
Tanzania,
South Sudan, Central.
Sudán.
You know, actually, we could probably claim to be the Brazil of Africa because
Podríamos decir
it has-
que es el Brasil de África
it has so many countries
porque
that,
tiene muchos
you know,
países
it shares borders
limítrofe.
with, yeah, like Brazil.
como Brasil.
The DRC was not isolated from the urbanization wave that took the world by storm in the early 20th century. This urbanization came with the new cultural tastes and music. Like other expressive arts had to adhere to these new changes. The desire and search for newness in all spheres of life defined these new urban centers. And indeed, Congo was not isolated. DRC was not isolated. As such, the Cuban, we can go to the next slide. As such, the Afro-Cuban music became popular in Congo, not only because it retained formal elements of traditional African musical performance, but also because it stood for a form of urban cosmopolitanism that was more accessible and ultimately more pleasurable than the various models of European cosmopolitanism which circulated in the Belgian colonies in Africa. While a number of scholars have agreed that Cuba has had the greatest influence on Congolese music, there is no agreed upon inspiring music genre. On the one hand, this origin points to the view that the Congolese rumba was inspired by Cuban son, as I have already mentioned, a popular global music of the 1930s and 1940s, while on the other hand, it claims that son is one of the many variants of this interesting genre. Similarly, Simon Santos Mulindwa Sagala, one of the surviving early Lumba musicians in Uganda, defines Lumba as, and I want to quote, let's go to the next slide. He defines it as the fusion of African traditional musical materials, especially from Central region from Congo, Brazzaville, Central African Republic, Cameroon, and then DRC, and beats from Latin American origin. Most influence is from the DRC, although other musicians came from Congo, Brazzaville, contributed. Latin American music was also a fusion of lumba, son, samba, merengue, and other musics. He attributes Franco Macchiadi, a Congolese musician, as being behind the fusion of the Latin American music and that of the Congolese lumba. Further, no agreed upon historical timeline of when Latin American music came to DRC. Some scholars claim that it is in the 1930s. Inspirations of African Cuban music were noted in the Congolese modern musicians, while others point to the 1940s. It should be noted, however, that Afro-Cuban inspirations did not exist in isolation from African music. This includes church music as well as European romantic ballads and ballroom traditions. Like many cultures,
Como muchas culturas,
most of the popular music in Africa,
la mayoría de la música popular de África
had a great influence of Christianity.
tuvo una gran influencia de la cristiandad.
In fact, most of the musicians that I'm working with right now,
De hecho, la mayoría de los músicos con los que estoy trabajando en el momento
they were formerly church musicians.
eran músicos de iglesia.
Although some still go to church on Sunday,
Aunque algunos van a la iglesia todavía el domingo,
and then the other days they can be in the bar and play
y los otros días pueden estar en el bar tocando música,
somehow the similar music.
samba o música similar.
So this music was also had a fusion of traditional music, different types of folklore and ritual-inspired musics, as well as the Afro-Cuban music. Moreover, the intra-Africa connections, such as those from West Africa, cannot be minimized. We have a long historical trace.
Tenemos una traza histórica larga, de larga data,
Since the 1930s,
de los años 30,
the connections between Uganda and Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Uganda, Cameroon, South Africa,
la conexión entre todos esos países que acaba de mencionar, Uganda, Kenia, Sudáfrica.
Yeah, so there's a lot of inter-Africa, trans-African relationships.
Hay muchas relaciones transafricanas.
However, the musicians fused the Latin American musical materials with the indigenous music and dance materials and Lingala language, which is a major language of the Congolese, the DRC Congolese, to domesticate the foreign music as Congolese. This domestication played a vital role in the national success of the music. Actually, it became even more because during independence, especially in the 60s, towards the
Se volvió
80s,
más popular, especialmente después de la independencia.
the Congolese musicians
Los músicos congoleños
became the stars during independence celebrations.
se volvieron las estrellas durante las celebraciones.
It is therefore this interaction of different musical voices that evolved into what came to be referred to as Congolese rumba, as well as Lumba Lingala, after the country's predominant local language. As such, Latin American Lumba did not only simply take over the music scene in the DRC, but as David Corporan, 2002, has also described this music as one that embedded a stylistic process of hybridization. So what is Latin American in Congolese Lumba? The most prominent influence was the new genre of orchestration. Mukuna has also recorded that the use of lead guitar, rhythm guitar, and bass guitar, a wind instrument, preferably a clarinet or even a saxophone, and an array of percussive instruments, including conga drums, maracas, and the cleves rhythm sticks, are very characteristic, borrowing from Latin America.
Son préstamos muy característicos de Latinoamérica.
But of course, we also know
Pero también sabemos que
they have their origin from Africa.
tienen su origen en África.
So it is from Africa to Africa.
Así que desde África a África.
White elaborates that whereas today we do not generally associate stringed instruments with Cuban popular music, the classic song compositions that most influenced early Congolese musicians gave a central place to the cousin of the guitar called the tres. Can we have the next slide?
Pasó recién. After close examination. Esa.
Yes, that one. Mukuna explains it further when he argues that, and I quote, after closer examination of Cuban lumbas and Zairean variants, it is safe to assert that what occurred in Zaire, now DRC, was not the adoption or the assimilation of the Cuban dance forms, but the interpretation of the name rumba, and the name of rumba was maintained by recording industries for commercial reasons. Indeed, the Congolese musicians domesticated or Congonized the Latin-derived music to relate to the musical context of the time. There is no doubt that the Congolese rumba became international acclaim in the 1950s. Some of the prominent Congolese lumbas that promoted lumba at the time were, we can see the next slide. We had John Kabsere, Franco Ruambo Makiadi, Franklin Moukaka, and we had Papa Wendo, Antonio Colosai, and then Johnny Bokole. These are people that most of my informants could remember as being very influential, and I will illustrate shortly.
Estas personas fueron muy influyentes en los años 30.
In the next section, I will examine the journey of Lumba from the DRC to Uganda. Can we have the next slide? This is basically
Esto es básicamente para
illustrate the proximity
para retratar la
of
proximidad
Uganda and Congo, and certainly
de Uganda y Congo.
When we talk about Lumba, that
Cuando
could even be called the Rumba region.
Cuando hablamos de la rumba, podríamos referirnos a esta región como la región de la rumba.
As Gerhard Kubik has noted in 1981, the history of popular music in Uganda, like other African countries, points to the influence not European, but from Afro-American, which was very effectively transformed and extensively Africanized. In addition, since the 1950s, there has been a strong continuing intra-African exchange of music. Thus, the new popular music of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda has been permanently influenced by Zaire, formerly Congo, and currently the Democratic Republic of Congo. While the media, especially Radio Uganda, which played various musics from Europe and the Americas, was a source of inspiration for musicians and the audience alike, in the 1950s, the strongest influence was from the Congolese Lumba. Some of the influencing Congolese Lumba musicians, I've already mentioned them, but most important was Franco Luambo Makiadi, and then Johnny Bokaka, as well as, of course, there are many that came in later, but I'm looking at those who came in between the 1940s, 50s, 60s.
Ella está examinando, digamos, aquellos músicos que tuvieron su trabajo durante los 40, 50, 60.
The Congolese music came to Uganda through 5 major means: the geographical and cultural proximity, the Uganda's involvement in the Second World War, the economic boom after the World War II, the Congolese migration to Uganda, forced and voluntarily, the media, the internal patronage of Congolese-inspired bands, and mutual exchange visits between musicians from the two countries, and this which resulted into collaborative performances. The artificial and porous borders created by colonialism between Uganda and Congo have through history enhanced the strong influence of Congolese music in Uganda. Because Kampala was the fastest growing urban center, it has been thought that Kampala was the first city to house Congolese rumba music. However, this is not true. There's a very other remote area in Uganda.
Hay una área muy remota en Uganda.
And Congolese Lumba first entered Uganda through Arua town in northwestern Uganda because of its geographical, language, and cultural proximity, as well as a center, as a growing town. Arua is on the west of River Nile, part of the West Nile, and the Lingala language, although of the Bantu language family, has some commonality with the Lugba dialect of the West Nile. Further, quoting Ephraim Bisase, Kubik notes that Lumba music was introduced to East Africa by people who had served the war, who went with the British Army to Kenya. By the way, Uganda was a British colony.
Uganda fue una colonia británica.
One of these early Lumba groups in East Africa was the Rhino Boys, which comprised of musicians from Kenya and Uganda. Moreover, the economic boom after the Second World War II enabled the colonial powers to invest in mass media development. Kubik reports that numerous radio stations were elected, and in East Africa, a record industry also was built up after 1945. The importation of European musical instruments and introduction of music education in Uganda by both the church and the colonial government enabled the learning of the musical instruments, which became the basis of the nature of popular music. Besides, from the late 1950s, the political crisis led many Congolese, including musicians, to flee to Uganda, which became the gateway to other East African countries. The Congolese refugees first settled in Uganda, particularly in Kampala, and the musicians found a new home at Mengo Kamuluba, where they shared musical experiences with resident musicians such as Hadija Namale, who was one of the early and only female musicians at the time. A number of Congolese musicians joined Ugandan bands and made Kamuluba in Kampala their new musical home. This interaction led to what Joachim Buembo, a Uganda journalist, has called Congonizing of Uganda, or Ugandanizing of Congo, the integration of Congolese and Ugandan music. Luganda, a language of the Baganda people from central Uganda. Apparently, I am from the Baganda ethnic group.
Aparentemente soy de Baganda.
And Uganda has about 65 different ethnic groups.
Y Uganda tiene aparentemente 65 distintas
So this language, Luganda, was sung with Lingala
grupos
accent.
étnicos. Perdón, I'm sorry. I didn't gather that it was ethnic groups. That it was
Okay.
65 of them. I'm sorry.
All right, it's okay. You are doing good.
Thank you. It's kind of stressful, you know, because interpreters are always hiding away somewhere and nobody sees them, right? So here I am, like following your text and then...
It's okay, dear. Moreover, the Ugandan musicians used this opportunity to learn and master the musical style, focusing on learning the instruments, especially the guitar. The other important source of influence of Congolese music on Uganda has, through history, been the media. Sharing his experience of the media influence, Sagara narrates thus, and I'm quoting, while at Kisubi Savio Junior Secondary School in Junior 2 in 1961, it's not on the screen. Yeah, it's okay. While at Kisubi Savio Junior Secondary School in Junior 2 in 1961, my friend called Peter Sewachilianga taught me the guitar. He taught me 3 chords, C, G, and D. I got so interested in playing the guitar because I also liked so much Frank Makiadi Luambo, the one I've just been mentioned, the most famous Congolese Lumba musician of all time of the TikTok jazz. I used to listen to his songs both at home and at school. At home, my father had a radio. Later, when I joined St. Mary's College, Kisubi, in 1964, by some good luck, the headmaster, Brother Paul, gave me the key to the hall where the school's radio was kept, and I was in charge of it. I would sneak into the hall at night to listen to Makiadi's songs on radio. Makiadi was a very popular musician who was always broadcast on Radio Uganda. Because the school had musical instruments, I could imitate Makiadi's songs on the guitar. That is how I learned how to play his songs. Makiadi used to play solo guitar, and that is how I got influenced. I'm also a solo guitarist. I listened to Mando, Matinda, and many others that were performed at the time, including Mario. And these songs influenced me. Moreover, the internal patronage of Congolese-inspired bands, especially in the 1970s, gave a boost to the influence of Congolese music in Uganda. The other side of Idi Amin, I know wherever you go, if the people don't know where Uganda is, at
Si
least
la gente no sabe dónde está Uganda,
they can always talk about Idi Amin.
siempre pueden hablar de Idi Amin.
But most of what is talked about him
Pero la mayor parte de lo que se habla de él
is that he was a dictator.
era que era un dictador.
But Amin had a human heart as well.
Pero también tenía un corazón humano.
Amin was a musician,
Amin era un músico
and he supported musicians.
y apoyó a los músicos.
In fact, we can talk about him in history
Podemos hablar de Amin, la historia de Amin,
as having promoted Congolese music in Uganda.
por haber promovido la música congolesa en Uganda.
The other side of Idi Amin, former president of Uganda between 1971 and 1979, is that is rarely documented was his love for music. Amin was a musician. He played the accordion, a promoter, and known for his patronage. According to Salter 2007, when Idi Amin took power in 1971, he made a special point of employing Congolese musicians. They donned Ugandan army uniforms and lived in army camps. Kanyina was one of those musicians who kept Amin's troops entertained and in camp at weekends. Indeed, it took the form of Amin calling on Ugandans to discard everything linked to the British imperialistic and Zionistic Israelis. As Damascus Kafumbe has also noted, 2014, owing to his avid love for Lumba and other Congolese dance musics, the president, Idi Amin, and his government endorsed massive influxes of musicians from the Congo region and surrounding areas. The endorsement saw an increase in Congolese dance music, especially Lumba, performances in Kampala nightclubs. These performances naturally inspired local groups to incorporate Congolese musical styles into their work, which also enabled them to keep up with the musical trends of the time. The influence of Congolese music has been further fostered by mutual exchange visits between musicians in Uganda and the DRC. For example, Franco Makiadi Luambo came to perform in Uganda in 1963. Similarly, Kafumbe reports that Moses Matovu, who is one of the most
Que es uno de los
popular musicians in the Afrigo band,
es uno de los músicos populares más conocidos de las bandas africanas.
one of the surviving live bands today, the longest surviving live bands today.
Una de las bandas más antiguas que todavía sobrevive.
Kafumbe writes, for example, Matovu of the Afrigo band and other musicians accompanied Amin to Central African Republic in 1977 to meet their emperor, Bokassa I. On his trip, Matovu and his colleagues performed with Congolese and West African bands. His interactions with the members of other bands and observations of their concerts gave him the opportunity to learn new material that he shared when he returned home. Matovu expressed that watching a performance by the Congolese musician inspired him to become a better musician, particularly to push his singing and saxophone playing to the next level. By the 1940s, the Congolese Lumba had already become popular, which attracted Israel Magembe and the pioneer Ugandan rumba musician to visit DRC Congo. He learned the Congolese guitar style, and when he returned to Uganda in the early 1950s, he established a band called Kampala City 6. These exchange visits continued through the years. For example, Phile Bongole Lutaya, one of the legends, the first one. one of the legends of the
Una de las
1980s.
leyendas de los 80.
I visited the DRC, and the Congolese Lumba influence can be heard in his songs. There are a number of songs where we can hear this influence. In fact, he recorded some of his songs in Franco Luambo Makiadi's studio. Father, Hadija Namale, one of the few female musicians of the time, as I've already said, also visited the DRC in the 1950s. She learned Lingala, and in fact, some of Namale's recorded songs are in Lingala. And other musicians included Fred Masagazi, Eklas Kawalia, Farida Sonko. In the late 1970s, the Frigo Band, and the oldest band in Uganda, began its journey in mastering the Congolese musical trade. Like the case in the DRC, the Ugandans did not simply embrace Congolese music. The musical materials appropriated from the Congolese Lumba has been Ugandanized, a term I've used to refer to the appropriation and domestication of foreign musical expressions to speak to the Ugandan context. However, this Ugandanization has not been uniform. Some musicians have adapted foreign instruments to simulate the indigenous musical nuances. In other cases, some musicians have employed a Lingala accent to sing songs set to Luganda, the most spoken language in Uganda. While Luganda, a dominant language in Uganda, was being used, the pronunciations and articulations adapted a Lingala intonation, and as such, Congonizing of Luganda or Lugandanizing of Lingala. I apologize, I can't play all these examples because...
Se disculpa por no poder reproducir todos esos ejemplos.
Yeah, but at the end of the presentation, which I'll
Pero al
play some
final
of the music.
de la presentación vamos a escuchar un poco de música.
Sharing about how his indigenous musical experience intersected with his love for Congolese Lumba, Sagala has told me, and I quote, "I learned by ear, and my prior musical experience was only from attending court music performances by court musicians. My father was the king's sub-county chief, and every Sunday he would bring court musicians to perform at home. Through imitation, again and with my siblings, we learned to perform the music and dance of the Baganda people. I have relatives who were the king's drummers and with whom we learned to perform music. Besides, my father had a gramophone and he used to collect LPs. I still have most of his collections from the 1920s and 1960s. My father saw that I had a musical talent, and he assigned me the responsibility of controlling the gramophone, and no other child was allowed to touch it. I also have a personal collection since 1964. In the 21st century, the presence of Congolese music in Uganda is still seen in the repertoire of bands performing at nightclubs. Speaking of their musical style, Sewanyana emphasizes that Lumba is still their lifeline in Afrigo band music. He says, and I quote, "There is no way you can eliminate Lumba from our music, from the rhythms to the way we play them. When it comes to dancing, one cannot go wrong. They see me do my steps. There is that element of Lumba in everything we do. Besides, most bands still employ Congolese musicians or Ugandans who are fluent in Congolese musical style. For instance, in the mid and late 1990s, for instance, Afrigo hired a Congolese musician called Amigo Wawawa, and many Ugandans at the time really can identify
Y
themselves with
muchos
his style.
ugandeses del tiempo se pueden identificar con este músico.
However, throughout history, there has been no band that performed entirely Lumba music. Similarly, Moses Matovu, the director of Afrigo Band, explained that depending on the song, we also play sukus, azok. Sometimes we throw in a little salsa to spice, as you know. We also borrow from the West. Our song Sirina, reverse, I don't reverse, is African, but it also uses an American beat. Our music borrows from anywhere, but it always has a Lumba flavor as well. Moreover, the explanation of the audience for live bands is to hear their favorite old song oldies. As such, while performing their own compositions, most live bands perform old popular songs, and indeed, Congolese music forms a big part of Uganda's musical scene, bridging the past and the present, and the past while projecting into the future. I'll now go into some illustrations. I will now briefly examine 3 musical excerpts, one from the Cuban Lumba song of the late 1920s, and 1920s, 30s, 40s. Okay, you'll excuse me, I try to get information around these particular songs. And because
Traté de
of my,
conseguir información sobre estas canciones en particular, pero
and because of my limitation of language,
por mi limitación de lingüística,
the very reason why I must quote you,
por eso es la razón por la que los cito.
I'll only focus on the musical, the musical elements rather than the context.
Se enfoca solamente en los elementos musicales más que en el contexto.
All the relics. All the relics.
All the what?
Relics, the text.
Y más que el texto.
However,
Relatos.
I'm very much aware that, analyzing the text and also understanding the context is very important in this discussion.
Ella está consciente de que es muy importante de todas maneras entender el contexto en esta discusión.
And again, what I'm providing is not a detailed analysis.
No hago un análisis exhaustivo.
In fact, I attempted to analyze each of the songs.
De hecho, traté de analizar cada una de las canciones,
And I found that I needed probably about 3 hours.
pero necesitaba como 3 horas.
And then when Laura sent me the time limit with translations and interpretations,
Entonces, cuando Laura me mandó me dijo el límite de tiempo, digamos, y lo de me pidió las traducciones,
so I decided to scratch on top.
decidió como solamente arañar un poquito la superficie, ver
Okay.
lo más general.
However, these songs are all performed between the 1930s and 50s. And I'll just look at, let's look at the first one. We are going to play them in a row, and then I'll just give a summary of what some of the musical ideas that I'm getting out of it.
Va a tocarlas todas al mismo tiempo y luego les va a hacer un resumen de las características.
Yeah, so this is the Cuban song.
Esta es la canción cubana. El son cubano, perdón.
Let's now listen to the Congolese influence.
Ahora vamos a escuchar la rumba.
Likambo ya kobeta kaka, tango ya soda boyo, lukaka baninga boko kanae, onde bomutaka, kasi ya komone langa, bonga da zali kwansiye, misala beta kiyoe, olo baki nini yo sonyo. Likambo ya kobeta kaka, ma famille baboyo. Lokola kana bunda kana koi kasi na koye bisayo sokyo bandili susu na kobengela yo misele amesana kobeta kayo. Likambo ya kometa kakai, tango ya sona boyo, tukaka maninga boko kanae, onde mobutaka, misale yaka mobalo ya lebisingai, ata oboka na kofuta obete yaka yeo, misale tata kainde kwa mobalite, saki ate misale nakomono pasio, ekeko ya mobalo yo, aligide ya bobangai, saki kambana bukuteo, nena kibakala
Let's go to the last one. Then the lumba from Uganda.
Likambo ya
Yes.
No, ahora es la rumba de Uganda. Sí.
Sana jari sipayo eno mutegeze mwana wa mbantu tanumya mwana mutegevu sana muwala mulungi muki wati yaterera takuma muntu tayomba mwana wa mbisanyo.
Sorry, I should have invited you to dance.
Los debería haber invitado a bailar.
I don't know whether you see any similarities.
No sé si ven
probably.
alguna similitud.
And as I said, I'm just going to give a scratch of what's happening.
Solamente voy a hablar de rasgos generales.
But also let's remember that it's not an issue of just taking over.
Pero recordemos que no solamente es un asunto de llevar.
There is certainly appropriation, but there's also domestication.
Hay apropiación, pero también hay domesticación.
And when we look at the Lumba of Uganda,
Cuando nos ponemos atención a la rumba de Uganda,
at the time,
en ese tiempo,
it's more graceful than the Lumba of the Congo.
es más agraciada que la rumba del Congo.
But there are certain things that bring it together.
Pero hay ciertos aspectos que las hacen coincidir.
And one thing that we would notice is basically the instrumentation.
Y lo que uno se da cuenta es, lo que uno nota, digamos, en los instrumentos.
While we don't have the guitar very prominent in the Cuban sound,
No tenemos una guitarra muy prominente en el son cubano,
but we see the importance that the roles that certain instruments take. Is
pero
similar.
vemos la importancia del rol que algunos instrumentos toman.
For example, they use the saxophone,
Por ejemplo, el uso del saxofón,
but then in the Congolese Lumba,
Pero
and of course Uganda, the guitar is prominent.
después en la rumba de Uganda y del Congo es prominente la guitarra.
Yes, and then we also
Gracias.
have the shakers and the singing. We have the prelude at the beginning, introducing, and then we also have interludes. In
Tenemos
between.
interludios, tenemos shakers
We
al
have
comienzo,
We have the dialogue between
tenemos el diálogo entre
the voice and the instruments.
La voz y los
kind
instrumentos.
Of a call and response kind of thing.
Eh,
And all the songs are in the same tonality, so there's no change.
no hay cambios, están en la misma tonalidad,
There's no change in harmony. It's basically the same chords that are moving through. It's fixed harmony. And what we would also call ostinato. It's very
lo que
common in
llamamos
all the
ostinato
musics.
es muy común en toda esta música.
And in this case, the drums and the bass take really that ostinato bass.
Esta es la traducción.
Okay, some differences. The guitars. The prominence of the guitars, as opposed to the saxophone in the Lumba, in the Cuban tone, is because they are stimulating the instrumental, the melodic, the rhythmic instruments, melodic rhythmic instruments in both in Congo, for example, the likembe, the lamellaphone, and also in Buganda, the ndongo instrument, the kind of plucking style. And then the vocal styles of the call and response pattern, which of course exists elsewhere, but we also know that it is also very, it's African derived, is very common in all the songs. Either it's between the voices or voice and instruments, or even the instruments kind of having a dialogic relationship together. I don't know whether you noted this really, especially in the Congolese lumba.
No sé si se dieron cuenta, especialmente en la rumba congolesa.
And I'm sorry, I'm not good at being interpreted.
No, dice que no es buena con que la interpreten.
Please forgive me.
It's okay, don't worry about it. If I don't get something or if you go too fast, I'll tell you, all right?
Sorry, dear.
It's okay.
I was going on my ride alone.
Se iba como rápido. Yeah.
I said I was going on my ride alone.
I know.
Okay. Yes, so I was saying we have the signaling changing from one section to another.
Tenemos
I don't know
un
whether we-
señalamiento cuando se va de una sección a otra, de un lado a otro.
Yes, in some cases they would change the speed,
En
but,
algunos casos se cambia la velocidad,
but in this case the speed was also maintained.
pero en estos casos la velocidad se mantiene.
I also want to say that these are not representative excerpts because each
Quiero
song-
decir que estos no son extractos representativos.
yeah, each music can be different even if you are
Cada
the same
música
performer.
Puede ser distinta
Each time you perform it.
cada vez que la tocan.
In both Congolese and Ugandan Lumba, there is use of signaling, as I said, and whenever they were introducing new sections. From this, I believe we are going to have quite a lot of discussion, so probably,
Creo que vamos a tener mucha discusión,
okay, I should leave some time for us to discuss.
así que debería dejar algo de tiempo para eso.
Yeah, so from this presentation, we've had a short journey from Africa to Latin America, being represented in this case by Cuba, to Uganda through the DRC. We have noted that while there may be geographical disconnection, music unites and reunites peoples. The other pertinent issue insinuated in the discussion is the power of music to reinvent itself as it moves from one place to the other. I hope that this presentation will trigger interest in collaborative research in order to unwrap the mystery of what has come to be called Lumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Uganda. Let's have my last slide.
Gracias.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for a wonderful presentation. I think she deserves another round of applause. Bueno, creo que todos compartimos la misma emoción de haber escuchado esta presentación tan absolutamente interesante. Tenemos tiempo para 2 o 3 preguntitas y después seguimos la conversa en un café, ¿vale? Así que pues abrimos el micrófono para quienes tengan preguntas.
So they're going to take 2 or 3 questions, and then you're going to keep on the conversation
Okay.
with the coffee break.
Thank you.
Aquí hay un micrófono. Está apagado. A la gente que pregunte, le pido por favor una idea a la vez para que yo pueda ir interpretando, por favor.
Ok. Voy a hacer una analogía. En el caso de,
I'm going to make an analogy in the case of
en el caso de la transición del
Of the
rhythm and blues
transition
al rock and roll, se podría
blues to rock and roll. You could say that
se podría decir que el rock and roll surge por una mala interpretación
That rock
de
and
los
roll
blancos
emerges-
de la música negra.
no te puedo interpretar así. Tienes que pausar, por
Sí,
favor.
ok.
Sí.
Eh,
So he says that rock and roll emerges as a misinterpretation of black music. That you could say that you could assert that.
es decir,
It means
los blancos querían tocar como
White
los
people
negros,
wanted to play like black people,
pero al provenir de otro contexto cultural y demás,
but because they came from a different cultural context,
su interpretación no fue igual a la de rhythm and
their
blues,
interpretation wasn't the same as rhythm and blues,
dando origen a lo que se denominó rock and roll.
giving origin to what was later called rock and roll.
Entonces, esta analogía
This
va
analogy,
en el sentido de, si usted cree
if you believe
que esas variantes
that those variants
del Congo hasta
of
Cuba
Congo to Cuba
podrían derivar de
could
ese intento interpretativo,
derive from that interpretive attempt,
pero entre comillas
But-
mal logrado,
quote unquote, quote, misinterpreted, unquote,
pero gracias a eso
but thanks to that,
generan o crean una nueva variante musical.
generate a new variant.
It's my question. Thank you so much.
Excuse me, could they probably write?
So,
Then
pregunta
you can read
si
it,
es que
because when
pueden
you read
escribir
once-
la pregunta
A word by word, it's hard for me to.
para poder responder.
So he's comparing rock and roll.
He's comparing, so what I sense from the question is that he's
Yes.
making an analogy between what happened or how rock and roll emerges as an interpretation of white people from rhythm and blues.
Okay.
He says it could be a kind of misinterpretation that gave birth to a new variant. So he's asking whether you think that that's what happened with Congo, DRC, and Ugandan rumba. That's the question, I guess.
Whether it's a misinterpretation.
Yes.
Okay.
¿Vamos a tomar más preguntas de una vez o?
Creo que ya nos están escribiendo.
Okay, so people are writing their questions.
Thank you. Mi pregunta es la siguiente.
My question is the following.
Usted habla del son y la rumba,
You talk about son and rumba,
géneros afrocubanos
of Afro-Cuban genres
que fueron investigados
that were researched
en profundidad,
in depth,
con rigor,
with rigor,
muy bien documentados
well
a lo
documented
largo del siglo XX
throughout the 20th
por
century
investigadores cubanos,
by Cuban researchers
desde Alejo Carpentier,
from Alejo Carpentier,
a Fernando Ortiz,
Hernando Ortiz,
Argelias León,
Ariel León,
Cristóbal Díaz Ayala
Cristóbal Díaz Ayala,
y muchos más.
and many others.
Sin embargo, usted no cita a
However,
ninguno de ellos.
You're not citing any of them.
Cita, en su lugar, cita
Instead, you're citing
investigadores americanos o europeos
American
más
researchers,
contemporáneos
more or less contemporary,
que bajo ningún punto de vista creo
that I think that under no point of view
superaron todas las investigaciones hechas por los cubanos
were able to overcome or get close to the research made by Cubans.
y da la impresión como que esos
And it seems to
investigadores
me that those researchers
no existieran,
didn't exist,
que esos trabajos no existieran
that those works didn't exist,
o que si existieron
or if they existed,
no tienen valor,
they have no
a
value,
pesar de que han sido traducidos,
even though they have been translated.
y creo que
And I think
eso me parece lamentable.
that's unfortunate.
Gracias.
So ¿cuál es su pregunta?
La pregunta es
No,
¿por qué
he's-
no lo cita?
He's
¿Por qué no se
commenting-
respalda?
So
¿Por qué
the
no se
question
apoyan
is
ellos?
why you didn't include them in your
Yes,
presentation.
I
Yeah.
have gotten his question.
Okay.
Ok,
Yes,
gracias.
Thank you. One more.
Una más, dice Sylvia. Una más. Allá al fondo hay alguien levantando la mano.
Hola, buenas tardes.
¿Qué cosa? No, porque una más. Vamos a tomar una más. No hay más preguntas. Sí. Ok.
Hola, buenas.
Hello.
Ella comentó en un momento
Sylvia, you commented at some point
que la rumba nació en
that rumba was born
en un contexto urbano
in an urban context
en la República del Congo y en
In-
Uganda
and in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda,
y los países aledaños a la República del Congo.
and the bordering countries of DRC.
Teniendo en cuenta de que África se compone de distintas etnias,
taking into account that Africa is composed by many ethnic groups,
mucho más allá de los distintos países que se conforma el continente,
beyond the number of countries that conform the continent,
mi pregunta es
my question is,
que si de alguna forma la homogeneización de
if in some way the homogenization of
cultura urbana
urban culture
ayudó de alguna forma
helped in any way
en las diferencias étnicas
in the ethnic differences
que conforman el África y los
that
problemas
conform Africa and the problems
que contrae así las diferencias étnicas, si es que la existieron y si de alguna forma la rumba ayudó como a apaciguar esos.
No, me tienes que repetir porque no, como hacer la pregunta un poco más sintética, tiene mucho.
La pregunta es
The question is again,
si a través de la homogeneización de la música, a través de la rumba,
through the homogenization of music,
ayudó como a derribar algunas barreras étnicas
whether music helped overcome some barriers originating from ethnic group differences.
en el caso de que existieran en el África. ¿Sí?
In the case they existed.
Okay, thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.
My colleague here asked
Mi colega
whether-
aquí me preguntó si es que
whether this music is a result of misinterpretation
esta música es un resultado de una mala interpretación
in comparison to rock and roll.
en
and
comparación al
those.
rock and roll y otras cosas.
It actually depends on whether you want to call it misinterpretation
Y
or
depende si lo quieres llamar
reappropriation.
una mala interpretación o una reapropiación,
Okay, yeah, because
porque
the way music influences us,
la manera en que la música nos influencia,
we can't tell whether it's misinterpretation because it's a personal experience,
Pa-
and then you decide what you want to take out of it to create your own music.
podemos pensar que es una mala interpretación, pero depende de lo que tú saques para tu experiencia.
Yeah, but we also know that in the past it has
Pero
also
sabemos
been,
que en el pasado
the so-called misinterpretation could be a
Las-
protest statement.
lo llamado mala interpretación podría ser
Yeah, because you don't want to conform to
Porque
the
no-
standards. It could be a protest as well. So,
podría ser una forma de protestar porque no se quiere conformar a un estándar.
yeah, so I wouldn't say whether it's misinterpretation.
No diría que es
or-
una mala interpretación,
Yeah, but what I know is that we choose and
pero
appropriate what we
nosotros
think we like to
elegimos y nos apropiamos de aquello que nos parece.
have. Coming to his question, where
Para
he
su
said
pregunta,
that there are many
Hay muchos,
scholars on Cumbian music, from Cuba,
investigadores
and they have
y
done
músicos de
so
Cuba
much research, and me to ignore them suggests
que
that probably they
han
didn't do
hecho
much.
mucha investigación que...
Yeah, colleagues, you would agree with me.
So, sorry, I'm going to ask you to go slowly, because, yeah,
Okay, I'm saying
Está
that
diciendo-
colleagues, you would agree with me.
que los colegas estarían de acuerdo conmigo con que
You know, we can't quote everybody.
no podemos citar a todos,
We can't make reference to everyone.
no podemos hacer referencias a cada uno,
And what you may have access to in terms of materials,
y lo que usted me podría haber preguntado en términos de material,
I may not have them.
puede que yo no los tenga.
And exactly that's why I've talked of collaboration.
Y por eso ella exactamente habló precisamente de colaborar.
Yeah, then we can share what
Y
you
podemos
have,
compartir lo que tenemos.
and then we build up the knowledge.
Y así construimos conocimiento.
Yeah, because the other question
Y la otra pregunta
was about whether this music
era si es que esta música
participated in bridging
participó en unir,
the
conectar
diversity in
la diversidad
in ethnicity.
en términos de etnicidad.
Yeah, definitely.
Y definitivamente,
Was that the question?
yes,
Yes. Definitely in
Definitivamente.
any cosmopolitan space
en cualquier espacio cosmopolita,
where we have so many different people coming from different
donde
areas.
tenemos mucha gente que viene de diferentes
Usually-
lugares, usualmente
Usually what brings us together
lo que nos une
is a mixture of what is local
es la mezcla de aquello que es local
and what is foreign.
y de aquello que es extranjero.
And in this case,
Y
when
en
the
este
guitar,
caso,
when the guitar plays instead of ndongo,
cuando se toca la guitarra en vez del ndongo,
no one can feel discriminated
nadie se puede sentir discriminado
because the guitar is simulating the ndongo,
porque la guitarra se toca simulando al ndongo,
but it is a different instrument.
pero es un instrumento distinto.
So no one can politically
Así que
say
nadie puede decir políticamente
that our music is not there.
que nuestra música no está allí.
So certainly in cosmopolitanism,
Así ciertamente en
music has enabled to bring together
la música ha sido capaz en
people
espacios
who are-
cosmopolita
people who are different,
de unir a gente que es distinta,
and we know that's how popular music has
y
developed
sabemos
in many cultures.
que
in many
esa es la
countries.
forma en que la música popular ha evolucionado en muchas culturas y en muchos lugares
And in many cities.
y en muchas ciudades.
Because when we all come together as
Porque cuando
musicians,
todos nos juntamos como músicos,
which has been the case,
que ha sido el caso,
the musicians from Congo,
los músicos del Congo,
the musicians from Uganda,
los músicos de Uganda,
and they were not only from one ethnic group. They came
no eran
from
solo de un grupo definido,
They came from different ethnic groups.
eran de diferentes grupos étnicos,
And in that way,
y de esa forma
they were brought together.
se unen, se reúnen.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. That's it. We're done. Yes.
Oh, those are the questions. I'm available for discussion.
Estoy disponible para cualquier discusión.
Oh, someone wants.
Parece que alguien quiere. En el café, me
Alright,
dicen acá que. So, over coffee, when we do the coffee break, people.
They say,
Laura nos está dando una más.
So, we're gonna take one more question.
oh, okay.
Okay.
That's fine.
¿Dónde está la persona?
Aquí al frente, Juan Fernando.
Vale. Muchas gracias por su presentación maravillosa. Aprecio que en este tiempo de desconexión podamos tener este espacio. No te escucho bien, perdón.
This kind of dialogue, south to
Tener
south, which
este diálogo.
I think that is a way to construct and networks of collaboration.
Es una buena manera de
Something that we
construir redes.
truly value. I just was wondering about this issue of the connection between appropriation and what you call domestication.
¿Quieres saber sobre la diferencia o la relación que existe entre la domesticación y la apropiación?
Particularly in the relationship between the emergence of
Particularmente la relación que
this idea of rumba, an African rumba,
cuando
sound,
emerge
African sound,
los sonidos africanos, la rumba africana,
within the framework of
en el
the
marco de
process of the end of the colonial rule in Africa that was happening during
el
that
el
same
proceso
time.
de término de
The
colonia,
end, el final del régimen colonial.
el final del periodo colonial.
And so also we
Yeah.
know that there was a Cubans, a lot of involvement of Cuba in this independence wars in Africa.
Y que sabemos que hubo involucramiento de
de
Cuba.
ejércitos cubanos peleando en las guerras de independencia en África, particularly particularly in Congo. Right?
particularmente en el Congo.
Yeah.
Hubo influencia de Cuba, presencia de Cuba.
But then I was wondering if there is also a connection that is possible to establish there, despite some different.
Si hay alguna conexión que sea posible de establecer ahí.
A connection between
between the arrival of this music, all this
And-
all this interchange between Cuba and the involvement of Cubans
Yeah.
in the African wars, and
And
also
Si es
the-
posible establecer alguna conexión entre la rumba y el colonialismo,
the end, el
al final del colonialismo,
and also this process of
y
domestication.
este proceso de domesticación.
Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitivamente
The interaction
la interacción
had an impact
tuvo un
on,
impacto en
or influenced the kind of music that came
de
out of
influenciar el
that.
tipo de música que
And when we talk of the domestication,
cuando hablamos de domesticación
we are talking about partly
hablamos parcialmente de
the use of the local language,
el
that's
uso
one
de
aspect.
del idioma local,
But also when you listen to the two excerpts that I had,
pero cuando tú escuchas los dos extractos que tocamos,
you realize that even when there is a particular instrument that takes prominence,
incluso que cuando hay un instrumento en particular que toma el protagonismo,
in the case of the instrument,
en
I
el
mean, in the
caso del
case,
instrumento,
in the case of the excerpt that I gave,
en el
for
caso
song,
del extracto que mostré,
they were not playing the guitar didn't get the prominence,
la guitarra fue lo principal,
but the structure, the formula is there. That
pero
is
la
an
fórmula está ahí,
instrument
la
that
estructura
has
está ahí.
prominence.
Hay un instrumento que tiene prominencia
And we know why the guitar took more precedence than probably the saxophone
y
at that
sabemos
time.
que no sabemos por qué la guitarra toma prominencia, por ejemplo, más que el saxofón en ese momento.
And that has an influence from the playing of the likembe,
Esa tiene una influencia de
the
cuando se toca el
mellophone,
likembe,
which is both rhythmic and melodic at the same
que es
time.
rítmico y melódico al mismo tiempo.
So basically there was that link. But,
Así que básicamente existía esa conexión,
yeah, but of course we would need
Pero-
more research in
pero
this
eso
area
establecer lo que preguntas necesitaría más investigación
to examine
para examinar
the kind of activities the
los
Cuban
tipos de
did while they
actividades
were in Congo.
que los tipos de the type of activities that
What the Cubans did when they were in Congo.
los tipos de actividades que hacían los cubanos en el Congo.
Were they involved in music making as well?
¿Estaban involucrados en hacer música?
Like, of course, it's very clear, you could tell
Es muy claro, pues, se podría decir que
the relationship of the Congolese in Uganda is a little
la
bit
relación
more
entre los
aligned,
congoleses y Uganda es clara,
because my research right now is based in Uganda.
porque mi investigación está basada en Uganda.
But I want to believe that a similar
Quiero
trend
creer
could have happened when the
que
Cubans came to
Podría haber pasado
to-
un
to-
intercambio
to the
similar
Congo.
cuando los cubanos fueron al Congo.
Yeah, definitely there must have been an influence.
Ella cree que definitivamente debe haber una
Either as
influencia.
audience, but we also know that at this time there was also the recordings that were also
Sabemos también que había
that
grabaciones
were circulating. I just
que
gave
estaban circulando.
an example
Ya di un ejemplo de
of a Ugandan musician who
de
has
un
never
músico
been to Congo, has never talked
ugandés
to,
que no había estado
to
nunca en el
Franco
Congo,
Macchiadi,
nunca había
but
hablado
he
con
plays
Macchiadi,
as good as
pero podía tocar también como
him from just
él.
listening to the recordings.
solamente por escuchar las grabaciones.
Thank you.
Gracias.